So let's start with a discussion of the acute effects of alcohol. When ingested, alcohol is absorbed in the small intestine, that is in the duodenum. It rapidly equilibrates with body water and therefore travels everywhere, including the brain. Because women have more fat and less body water than men, proportionally speaking, they attain a higher blood alcohol concentration than men, with everything else being equal. Because they attain higher blood concentrations, alcoholic women also show more health problems and a more rapid progression to health problems than alcoholic men. This more rapid progression is called telescoping. Once alcohol reaches the brain, there is no specific receptor for it. However, brain regions such as the cerebellum and frontal cortex, which contain more GABA-benzodiazepine receptors, are more affected than other brain regions. The more pronounced effect of alcohol on these receptors is why tests of cerebellar and frontal cortex function are part of the field sobriety test. In that test, nystagmus, motor coordination, and cognitive flexibility are frequently evaluated because they are regulated by brain regions more affected by alcohol. Unlike alcohol, other drugs of abuse have specific endogenous receptors and therefore have more specific effects. Nicotine targets a subgroup of cholinergic receptors. Cocaine and amphetamine specifically target dopaminergic receptors. Cocaine blocks dopamine reuptake, amphetamine facilitates dopamine release, and marijuana affects CB1 receptors in the brain and CB2 receptors in other regions. One important neurobiological difference in the response to alcohol is related to the presence or absence of a family history of alcoholism. This neurobiological difference may explain why people with a family history are more addiction-prone than others. This graph summarizes literature on the subjective effects of acute alcohol in two groups: sons of alcoholics labeled SOA and sons of non-alcoholics labeled SONA. There is a body of research suggesting that children of alcoholics are innately hypersensitive to the rewarding effects of alcohol as blood alcohol levels are rising, but more tolerant to the adverse effects of alcohol as blood alcohol levels are falling. Immediately after drinking, children of alcoholics report feeling more of a buzz or a high. Yet several hours later, they appear less impaired. For example, their motor coordination recovers faster, and they report feeling less of a hangover after drinking. Several researchers have argued that this is why children of alcoholics can continue to drink when others are forced to stop. We'll talk more about family history in another presentation. The neurobiological mechanisms explaining the rewarding effects of drugs of abuse are typically shown with a slide like this. It has been the prevailing view for some time, so talking about it is almost obligatory. We'll not dwell on it too long. The story goes as follows. Drugs of abuse act on dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area, labeled VTA here, in various ways to promote dopamine activity. The VTA then projects to many different brain regions. The projection targets are the nucleus accumbens, also called the striatum, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. Through these different projections, drugs of abuse can elicit positive responses in motor activity, memory, emotion, and produce a change in attentional focus. All of these responses can be reinforced with continued use. There is also literature showing that repeated use of drugs exhausts or somehow changes these pathways. The end result is dopamine receptor downregulation in the striatum. The striatum is the area shown in brighter colors on the slide. Note that across several categories of drug abuse, cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, and heroin, the striatum is less brightly colored. These neuroimaging data depict a reduction in dopamine binding in drug abusers and a so-called reward deficiency syndrome. The hypothesis is that this deficit state is what chronic drug abusers want to correct. And indeed, there is a literature suggesting that with continued consumption of a drug of abuse, there is a switch or a neuroadaptation. The nervous system adapts to the presence of the drug so that the drug is no longer as rewarding. The goal of the user therefore changes from seeking a high to avoiding or alleviating a deficit state. That deficit state may initially appear as physiological withdrawal of some type. It is especially severe for alcohol and heroin abusers. But it can also appear in a more protracted form. This is sometimes called protracted withdrawal or protracted abstinence. It is not a certainty that the cessation of substance use will always cause withdrawal and a relapse. There is tremendous variability across individuals. There are also examples in the literature wherein the environment can intervene to change the course. One famous example is a natural experiment that occurred during the 1960s when soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. They were surviving in an impoverished environment, and a sizable number of them were using opiates at the time. There was a concern that they would return home from Vietnam and continue the bad habit. Fortunately, that did not occur in most cases. When many of them returned to a richer environment, they did not continue to use. There have been attempts to replicate this natural experiment in a controlled way with animals in a laboratory. In this case, researchers have compared drinking rates by animals living in either an impoverished or enriched environment. The findings are relatively mixed, though. But the preponderance of evidence suggests that the presence of enriched environments with distractors can reduce substance use and relapse risk. And that is the end of this lecture.